Well, Thomas Burbell, what a pleasure I was head of AXA. What a pleasure to be with you on this stage to start the discussions I was just talking about. I can't think of a more interesting person to have a discussion with, and a person that I enjoy very much as well, which is an extra bonus. Um, well, there's so much going on. He was talking about, the pandemic, we're talking about the war. But, I think really, Thomas, I was thinking it's the first time in our generation, certainly our generation, that we can think of that we have the factor of geopolitical risk that we actually have to factor into our businesses. And when you think of it, we have the inflation, we have the rising rates, the slowing economy. You and I have both been through that. We know we kind of know how to manage that somewhat. But the geopolitical risk is a totally different factor. And I was wondering, how do you, Thomas, approach that challenge in your AXA group, and how do you think about it?
Thanks, Paul. Great to be with you again. It is true that we are in a phase now that we probably have never seen beforehand, because there was a crisis, then there was a little period of tranquility, and the next crisis. Here we have one crisis after the next, and even some crises at the same time, which calls for the question: how do you manage it? But also, how do you keep your colleagues really very much on the ball all the time? Because crisis demands an extra effort and also has a certain fatigue. And so this makes it difficult today to really understand the overlay of the different crises. And what was interesting, we do a future risk report every year. And what's quite interesting to see is that the hierarchy of risks does change over time, but it has more or less stabilized. But this question around everything is now intertwined, be it that the risks are dependent on each other, and that there is also different appreciation of the risk by generation, makes it very difficult and makes it difficult for business. And certainly an insurance business is often very linked to political decision processes, as you know very well, which means that the world around us is getting more complex, and managing in this world gets much more complex.
It's so fascinating what you say, because I so much agree with you that people start with is always the number one issue in our businesses, and keeping people motivated. But I loved your idea of the unintended consequences. There's no end to the unintended consequences that are out there. And that's what makes it so difficult to plan. One of the things I've been trying to do is that when there are unintended consequences that are quite large like that, my mind was sort of going back to the balance sheet versus just the income statement. And I started thinking to myself, wow, what can I do with my balance sheet to make sure that I'm secure? So I think of things like liquidity. I think of fixing my interest rates, so that if I'm going to face bumps, I can get through the storm. And I sort of think of that as well as I think the key thing you mentioned, which is the people factor. Now, what it brings us to is that with this additional disruption, we've been living it, and we're all living it in this room, is the trust factor, I call it. And the breakdown in trust in civil society, and I think social media is not helping, it's just accelerating it by bringing people on to their different points of view and augmenting them. But how do you think this trust factor affects you and I'd love you to observe on some of the different countries. You're such a global company, and how you think about this trust factor affecting you and how you operate.
Look, trust is the glue of our life, is the glue of social relations. So yes, I would not say that trust is falling away. I would say trust is being redistributed, because without trust, we cannot live. Again, when I go back to the future risk report that we do, we see exactly that. So trust is falling away when it comes to the trust in particular public authorities of dealing with the very large challenges that we've got. But we see as well, and you see all of this in your own companies, that the trust towards companies has increased, in particular during COVID times, because companies were extremely agile in making things happen, be it from a perspective of security of their employees, be it from continuing service in a very difficult time. And so I would say it's a rebalance of trust, which means that if there is more expectation on companies, our role will also change. We will not become public authorities, I hope, but we will need to contribute to the well-being of society in a very different way. And I think this is also good, because if you go back where your father has maybe started, which was exactly in that spirit at the time, the entrepreneur was the entrepreneur, but also the person looking after the well-being of the community. And we're probably coming back to this again. I think that's not bad.
You know, I think it's so important. I'm so happy you mentioned my father as an entrepreneur, because when I think back of what he left us, it wasn't just his entrepreneurship, which was one thing, but you're right. It was sense of society and caring for society, and the sense, and that's where I feel that capitalism, you know, in a sense is getting a raw deal, because often, if you're able to be profitable and do well and give a service to your clients, to your employees and jobs, you then have the prosperity to contribute to your society and be able to get involved with your society. And you're only as good as the people in your society. And so I think you make a very important point. I know we've been involved with so many aspects of society, and of course, education being a crucial one in terms of helping all the young people being able to prosper and grow, and have been involved in so many things of that nature. I wonder now if we might turn to another part of the world as you deal with different countries in the world. I know you've been involved with China, because I remember again, my father being one of the first people to break into China, it brought me to China, and I got to know a number of vice chairmen there. And actually, once Claude Bébéa approached me and said, Paul, would you come with us? We're going with all our employees to China, and we all slept on the Great Wall. And I introduced Claude to one of the vice chairmen that was head of banking and everything, because Claude had this idea that he wanted to start business in China. And I was actually there on this first meetings when he first got started, which is quite incredible when I think of it. And today, China, of course, with Xi's reappointment, has a new focus on China, I would say, I guess the best way to put it. Not clear. Nobody's totally clear on what that is right at this time, but it certainly is new. It's certainly not Jen Zemin or Deng's focus. That seems quite clear. So I wondered what your take is on, as you do business in China, on what's going on in that market and that country.
You're absolutely right that AXA was very early in China, and this famous episode of Claude being on the Great Wall with his leaders at the time is still in everybody's mind. We were at some point even the largest foreign insurer in China. So we've been there early, and we are quite invested in it. And when you look at it today, I think the last couple of months have brought some clarity also around what the future could look like, because China is a very large market, is a market that remains a growth market, whether it's 6% or 5% or 9%. It is a growth market, and there is still need for development when you look at the question of the development of the population, and certainly in our business when it comes to health insurance, when it comes to retirement. So China is a market that one cannot neglect. The question is more how in this new setting, and also how in this new geopolitical setting, in which the question might become more choose left and right, can you still operate and remain global at the same time? And when I speak about China, obviously we need to more speak about Greater China, which also includes Hong Kong today, in which many of the Western companies have traditionally got a larger position. So for us, and for me, it's more that question, how can we be successful in a new setting?
Yes, I think that you're right. I think it'll be interesting. I think of, I guess, two things on this idea of being, how can you be successful in a new setting? As I was saying earlier in my comments, I think if they rein in freedom too much, I think that they will stifle in innovation. And I that's the one thing I'm worried about, and I'm hoping that they don't rein it in too much, so that all these entrepreneurs that created Tencent and many others, TikTok and so many companies, are able to continue and create an effervescence in that country. If you take that away, I'm not sure what will happen in that respect. The other thing that comes to mind as you talk about China is what Hank Paulson said as to how do we think about China. And, as you're saying, 25% of the world's manufacturing is China. I mean, we can't ignore it. We're going to it's like turning the dial to zero if we decide to cut it off. So that I don't think that's possible. But I think Hank Paulson came up with a cute concept. He said, the garden's going to have to get a little smaller and the fence is going to have to get higher. And I think really what he's getting at is that everything that's technology and military enabler, the fence is going to have to get higher and be more restricted. But that doesn't mean that the rest should be ignored, which I think is really what you're getting at and which we have to, I think, try and work on. And we're involved in China, as you know, have been there for 40 years when they first opened. And we are there as well. And watching carefully, of course, how things develop. That's all you can do.
It's exactly the right approach.
And try and be active too. The idea that Nixon had of engagement is an important notion, I think, with
yeah, it's also in our industry, insurance looks at the very long term, which by definition depasses, this president and the next president. And so when I look at a country, I look at demographics.
Yeah.
And which is a very long-term view, which is probably the luxury of our industry.
Yes. I think in a sense you're saying you have to separate the leadership from the people. They're two very different things. And the leadership changes, as you say.
Yeah, look, basic needs in populations will survive leaders or generation of leaders.
That's it. That's a great comment. I wonder if we might talk about AXA for a while, which would be kind of fun. I think you have initiated, of course, so many changes as CEO. And I'd like you to share with us some of the new directions you've taken and also how you've implemented change. Because it's one thing to think about change and strategies. It's another one to get people and everybody energized behind them. I'd love to hear you on that subject.
So beyond this question around going to the Great Wall, AXA is certainly a relatively short history of very courageous decision and entrepreneurship. If you think I'm only the third CEO in over 30 years, so there's a long history, but a long history of great decisions. And so thinking about where we are today, we are again in a very different environment. And we were in a period in which interest rates were very high, focused very much on savings products. We were very global because at the time it was, how do you conquer the world? Today you see that we're in a different space. Financial markets have become very volatile. Interest rates, and certainly real interest rates, are very low and remain low. Regulation has increased, and as we said earlier, Paul, the geopolitical complexity has increased. So our aim is clearly now to say, look, how can we focus on AXA? How can we focus AXA on the areas that really matter to customers? And when you look today, what matters is entrepreneurial risk. So how can a company navigate in this new environment? How can a company cope with new risks as well, if you think about cyber, natural catastrophes, and so on? And secondly, health and protection. I think post-COVID, this is probably now the topic for all of us. What does it mean to live a better life? And so we've shifted the company from 80% life and savings on 100 billion revenue to 20% life and savings on 100 billion revenue. So it was a tough journey in changing the portfolio, which was not always appreciated by market as investors. But if you look today, we are now the number one insurer globally for enterprises. And we are one of the largest insurers for health and protection. This was exactly what we wanted. And we have tightened our geographical footprint to a much simpler model. And so if you look today, where do we stand? We are very much in this position with a very strong balance sheet, because what you said earlier, in times of volatility, having a strong balance sheet, having a lot of cash, and also being disciplined is absolutely key. So today, we are in a very solid position, and the aim going forward is to develop the platform. How do you engage people with it? Well, you have to engage them on a dream. And that's what Claude Bébert did from the very beginning. He said, look, we want to become from a very small mutual in northern France to the largest insurer globally. And he did it. And our aim was, how do we become from a large life and savings company, a little bit everywhere, to the leader in commercial risk, the leader in health, in a very focused global manner. And that's where we are today.
Well, I really congratulate you because you helped build a fantastic company. And what really I love is that you're a public company that's kept an entrepreneurial spirit. And that's not easy because we have ownership. It's a little easier, but for you, it's not easy. And to create and infuse that dynamic is really impressive. You talked about the casualty business really. And I'm fascinated by that because we're a retrocessionaire, as you know, in my business. So we reinsure some of your business. And I'm sort of, the climate industry, the climate that we're in is creating huge important losses in the world. And I just think back to Florida of Hurricane Ian, which is 50 billion plus. We don't quite know where it's going to end up, but it's a huge number. I know as a retrocessionaire, I kick in only at 12 billion and more, which is a rarity. But it sure kicked in last quarter. I can tell you, we took a big loss. And I wonder how your industry is coping with this and how you think about it, because I know there's also some social disruptions now I read about in Florida where people just can't afford insurance. And then bigger people are coming in, buying out small homes and building condos that supposedly can afford them. So there's practically a societal impact, I would say, to some of this climate change that we're just starting to see the tip of the iceberg. But what are some of your feelings about all this?
So it's true that Hurricane Ian has certainly damaged a lot of homes and have put people's lives in severe disarray, which is always a terrible thing to happen. We have roughly 0.7% market share on this total loss, so a relatively, I would say, manageable exposure, because we have been managing down our natural catastrophe exposure over many years. Because if you look at the tendencies today, you still got the hurricanes that you used to have 10, 20 years ago, but you've got a lot of more what we call secondary perils, wildfires, floodings, droughts that have massively increased in frequency. And it's those risks that are today not yet properly priced. And I believe if you are in a business, you need to get the right price for it. But secondly, we also need to make sure that we do not forget the prevention angle on it. You can work on prevention. If you look, for example, at Hurricane Katrina at the time versus Hurricane Irma above Louisiana, same pattern, 10 years difference, and the cost has actually gone down. Going back to your question about social tensions, and I think that is something that we need to pay massive attention to. The cost of risk are increasing every year, natural catastrophe only being one example, which means that it gets more and more difficult for people to insure, which leads to the fact of exclusion. And this is probably the one thing that our industry needs to pay massive attention to. How can we find a solution that is such that we are not excluding these people anymore? Today, we are very much in that view, okay, we can't insure, it's too expensive, we don't take care of the segment. Yet the segment gets bigger and bigger. And so it is absolutely important for us to rethink our model and find a solution to include more people in our proposition.
Yeah, I agree with you, because I think that I saw in Florida recently, the governors convened people to start to thinking, how can Florida get involved and how can the government get involved in helping also with group insurance or all kinds of laying off the things. Clearly, we're living in increased volatility. It's just everywhere. I don't want to leave this meeting without giving everybody the opportunity to listen to what corporate decision makers who are here struggle as they navigate with this environment. What advice would you give to people in the room about dealing with volatility?
But it's three pieces. One is be disciplined. Now it's the time to be extremely strict with yourself and with your company. It goes back to what you said, Paul, around keeping a very solid balance sheet, making sure you're looking at cash, and be extremely disciplined. Don't be tempted to do the big deal quickly or to do a deal quickly that you'll regret later. Second one, be extremely diversified. You don't know where it explodes tomorrow. So we've been really making sure that we put our eggs in many baskets to not be surprised. And then I think there is a third one, which is be extremely cautious and listen extremely well, also to the to the things that could emerge. I think the biggest risk today is that we are missing a trend that is coming out of nowhere, and that tomorrow changes your equation. And there was a book at the time. It's only the paranoids who win. This is what sometimes inspires me when I look at that situation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to listen and to think about what's coming down the pike next. That's why these conferences are so important, because it gives you a chance to interchange with people and to be thinking and confronted with ideas. I have a little paradigm. I say, when you're driving, you used to one foot in the brake and one foot on the gas. I keep one foot real close to the brake, but I keep moving on the gas. And so I find that it's a funny thing. I think you have to try and keep moving forward, and yet be very quick to stop and to be careful and to pause is kind of
also, sorry if I may, not to forget that there are opportunities as well. We always look at the downside. There is plenty of opportunities today, and maybe that's the fourth one. Yeah. Do not forget the angle of opportunity.
That's exactly it. That's why I keep my foot on the gas moving forward. I want to end. We have just a few seconds, but I can't let time go by without saying, you're an extraordinary individual because you have a Swiss nationality, a German nationality, a French nationality, and you can see you're very fluent in English. That's not your problem. But, this current cultural diversity that you have is really quite fantastic. And I wondered how that's helped you face challenges at AXA or in your life in general. How has it been a help to you?
I mean, I was forced and wanted to as well in different situations to integrate myself in a new setting, which means that you need to understand your setting very well. You need to listen to the setting, and you need to adapt to the setting. And this is, I find, fantastic, because you don't give up yourself, but you are just adding to yourself, and you become a different person, and but not losing your roots. And I think the combination of strong German discipline, a very strong Swiss compromise culture with a strong vision and growth spirit of French nature is a good combination.
I would agree with that. Very good. Well, Thomas, thank you for your time. I must say I'm only a recipient of British and French nationalities because Canada was founded by both those countries, and the Aboriginals, of course, originally as well, which had a wonderful culture as well. I must say one of the things I took away from it, I think, is it gives you a chance to have empathy. It's a funny thing, and I know you have empathy. And I think, sometimes when you're used to having different cultures, listening to different people, you learn to feel for people. And I think that's something we all need a little more of. But Thomas, a real pleasure to have spent this time with you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Paul.